A much welcomed return of handshake diplomacy and an end to Zoom conferences this weekend as leaders of the world's 7 wealthiest democracies convened, joined also by 4 guest nations, including South Korea. From the G7's COVID plan and climate change to China dominating the G7 summit in Cornwall this year, South Korea also had its own agenda heading into the summit. As the leaders kick off their final day at the beachside summit, I have a group of diplomatic and political experts from around the world. First, joining us from Wien is Professor Michael Reiterer of Brussels School of Governance, EU Ambassador retired. Ambassador Reiterer previously served as the Ambassador of the European Union to South Korea. And now from Britain, from Cambridge, Dr. John Nilsson-Wright, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia with the Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House. And Stephen Norber, Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University and a Senior Advisor to the UN Program on Northeast Asia. Dr. Norber also served as a Senior Analyst for the U.S. State Department in previous administrations. I want to welcome all gentlemen to the show. It's great to see you all. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kanya.
Now, so as the leaders wrap up their final day of the 3-day summit, all eyes are on what the joint communique will carry or how many times China will be mentioned in the statement. The G7 leaders are still debating how strongly to respond to China's effort to win influence around the world and rebuke it over alleged forced labor practices. Apparently, some G7 leaders disagree with U.S. President Joe Biden's push for a collective hawkish stance against China. How successful will President Biden be in better positioning the U.S. and its allies to compete with China in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic and confronting China's authoritarianism? I want to start with you, Dr. Norber.
Sure. Well, certainly this is the first G7 that's really explicitly aimed at China, and largely Biden will be successful in terms of getting that underscored on issues of supply chain, on issues of international concern, calls for transparency and accountability, where it may not be as strongly worded in the final communique, maybe around human rights. He'd like very specific mention of Xinjiang and the U.S. concerns there, but there certainly will be inclusion of human rights among the concerns that the U.S. has about China, and which is reflected by the international community and those gathered as well.
And we are just getting reports that per EU officials there in Carbis Bay, the word Xinjiang and issues of that will be included in the joint communique. Where is the UK? What's the UK stance in all of this, Dr. Nilsson-Wright?
Well, the UK, I think, is quite close to the United States in terms of identifying the importance of having a coordinated response to the China challenge. But there is, I think, an important difference of emphasis. According to one British official who's been quoted in the British press, it's important to underscore what we are for rather than what we are against. So I think we will see in the communique an effort to double down on the importance of democracy and free and open societies. And of course, that implicitly will be a criticism of China. We're also, I think, going to see, probably as part of the summit communique, an agreement on what people are now talking about as a green alternative to China's Belt and Road, as I think some of your earlier reports foreshadowed. And this is an effort, quite a sensible effort, I think, to look at infrastructure cooperation. And that's something that the British government, I think, is strongly in support of. We would like to see this develop. The question is, of course, the scale of this and how effectively it can be rolled out.
Absolutely. And the European Union, I mean, it's pretty apparent, Ambassador Reiterer, that there are disagreements within the EU itself among member countries on their approach to China. I wonder how effective their China policy will be if there is a France's China approach, Germany's China approach, rather than an EU-wide coherent policy.
Well, I think there is a European-wide policy. The strategic outlook, which was agreed by all member states in 2019, came up with these 3 elements. China is a partner, is a competitor, and a systemic rival. That was also taken over by the United States. They also look at it in this way. So I think this is a united position. And you have also seen that the European Union has passed sanctions against China because of human rights. And again, you can only pass sanctions in the European Union if you have unanimity. So I would not say differences. I would see a difference in style and in diplomacy. You can pass on messages very clearly in a diplomatic manner without hammering your message. And I think this is something which the European Union is seeking, but there is no doubt that human rights are a big concern, and the European Union has always spoken out, including the sanctions I have mentioned. But the whole G7 summit is not only about China, but all the other elements which you have presented in your show so far. And I think we should have also a nuanced approach and looking at it comprehensively.
Right. So the core message on human rights is a universal one among EU members, is I think what you're saying. The G7 leaders are aiming to end their first summit in 2 years with a punchy set of promises, including vaccinating the world against coronavirus, making huge corporations pay their fair share of taxes, and tackling climate change with a blend of technology and money. Now, non-G7 nations, India, South Korea, Australia, and South Africa, were invited to attend as guests. What does this G7 Extras guest list reveal about UK's foreign policy aims, Dr. Nilsson-Wright?
Well, for the UK, of course, in the aftermath of the British decision to leave the European Union, the question of Asia looms very large. So for countries like India and South Korea, it's very important, I think, for Britain to advance its engagement in the wider Indo-Pacific region. So they have welcomed the participation of those two countries. Of course, that was very much the result of the Trump administration. It was Donald Trump, in fact, suggested the expansion of the G7 to incorporate those additional countries. Britain, of course, is looking to join CPTPP. It's also now trying to partner with other countries in the region, having deployed a flotilla of British ships to the region. So there are many ways, I think, in which Britain can seek to try and emphasize its coordination with some of those countries. You mentioned, however, some of the elements of this this meeting, in particular the question of a global vaccine. It's very striking, I think, that former Prime Minister Gordon Brown has come out very forcefully this morning in criticizing the summit as a moral failure for committing only to the provision of some 1 billion doses of vaccines. And we've seen, in terms of public protests, further, I think, disquiet about a failure of ambition. So however much the rhetoric around the summit is going to be in terms of coordination, a lot of people will be asking the question whether Britain should try to do more in encouraging a more ambitious approach on the vaccine issue, particularly, of course, given Britain's very clear success at home in rolling out vaccines for its own citizens.
Right. So, yes, I have heard about former Prime Minister Gordon Brown's criticism about lack of commitment there. Now, Ambassador Reiterer, what was South Korean President Moon Jae-in able to bring to the G7 table, and what kind of a role do you think South Korea played at the G7 summit this time?
Well, I think first of all, guests at the G7 indicate an openness, and it is therefore good to have additional input from the region. And I think South Korea, and in particular President Moon Jae-in, have well prepared with especially when it comes to climate change. P4G summit, I think, helped to upgrade the awareness of climate change, which has not gone away of the pandemic. It is a good preparation also for the upcoming COP 2026 meetings. In addition, Korea has a very good track record in fighting the pandemic, and it has done so not only looking back, but also looking forward, and has lent its support for the treaty which will fight future pandemics. I think this is extremely important, and also to help fight the pandemic today. I think there the European Union is looking eagerly for partners. It also has to be mentioned, perhaps also in reply to Mr. Gordon Brown, the European Union is actually exporting half of its vaccine production to the rest of the world, and has committed to continue and to reach 700 million doses by the end of the year. Last but not least, I think it is important also in terms of values that a partner, a strategic partner of the European Union and of the Western world is sitting at the table as an honored guest.
Right. However, South Korea does find itself a little bit in an awkward position, perhaps, Dr. Norber, as the summit focuses on ways that democracies can collaborate to build a more inclusive and fair global economy and compete with rising, quote, autocracies like China. Leaders of the G7 plus the invited nations are expected to be discussing ways to respond to forced labor in supply chains, pursue an affirmative infrastructure initiative that's high standards and transparent, and coordinating on supply chain resilience and technology standards so that democracies are aligned in supporting each other. Now, what would be the best strategy for President Moon right now?
Well, I think President Moon will tack with Joe Biden in the sense that, as the American officials explained, to cooperate on climate, to compete on supply chains, and to contest on human rights, meaning that there's a great deal that unites the United States, South Korea, and the other partners attending this meeting, well beyond the concern about China explicitly, but certainly the rise of autocracies concerns these democracies. So while it's a challenge for South Korean policymakers to establish that management of relations with their near neighbor China and their largest trading partner China, they do have that firm relationship with the United States and with the broader international community, and so much on offer by way of capacity, whether it be on green technology, or vaccines. And so that really brings them together and creates common cause. And that makes it actually less difficult because there really is a very clear road ahead, and that is promoting democracy, encouraging transparency in the rule of law, and helping where it can in terms of vaccine and other distribution. So I think that bodes well for South Korea and the United States and that bilateral relationship.
Now, Dr. Reiterer, I ask you this question as to someone with decades of diplomatic career. China today pointedly cautioned G7 leaders that the days when small groups of countries decided the fate of the world was long gone, hitting back at the group of seven which have sought a unified position over Beijing. How relevant do you think the G7 is in 2021? I mean, is there a need for the informal gathering to be expanded and evolve to a D10, D11, I don't know, maybe a G12 perhaps?
Well, I think in times of COVID, and unfortunately we are still there, a little bit smaller meetings are easier to handle. So that's an advantage right now. The G7 is not a directorate. I think it is a means to exchange views and to build up consensus. And G7, because of this invitation policy, has a great deal of flexibility to invite all these leaders who are important and can contribute to the issues under discussion. It is also not a small group. If you look in terms of trade, in terms of GDP, in terms of people, you see that it is it can function as a sort of laboratory for ideas, which then, of course, are brought to a larger circle. Other guests around the G7 is the Secretary General of the United Nations. It's the Secretary General of the World Health Organization. There is a virtual participation of the Director General of the World Trade Organization, and India can only participate because of COVID online, one of the most populous nations in the world. So small, perhaps to a certain degree in numbers, but as it is not a directory, as it is a laboratory laboratory of ideas, which reaches out. I think it hasn't functioned. I would criticize it heavily if it were the only show in town, but this is certainly not the case. And we then go to G20 as the next step, which actually is also larger than G20 because of inviting guests.
So G7 and G20 with guests. Dr. Nilsson-Wright, there had been talks of a possible sit-down, if not even a pull-aside between Moon, Biden, and Suga, or one between Moon and Suga this time, considering how intimate this setting is at this beachside resort heading to the G7 summit in Cornwall this year. Apparently, it didn't happen. All we've heard is that President Moon and Prime Minister Suga exchange short hellos. The first couples exchange shorter hellos in the evening, not even a small informal chat. What does this say about the trilateral and Seoul-Tokyo bilateral relations?
Well, it is regrettable, isn't it? I mean, these two countries, core allies of the United States, with common interests when it comes to dealing with North Korea and a host of other issues. I think this reflects basically politics. Prime Minister Suga is very unpopular within Japan. In the run-up to the Olympics, we have about 80% of the Japanese public fiercely opposed to the Olympics. Prime Minister Suga is preoccupied with those domestic issues, reaching out to South Korea at a time when the bilateral relationship is characteristically undermined by disputes over history and the legacy of the colonial period. I don't think he wants to take that risk, and he doesn't have enough, if you like, political skin in the game to move ahead with the meeting. However, having said that, I think it's some of the other meetings that are taking place with other officials. You mentioned the meetings between the foreign ministers of the United States and South Korea and Japan. These are the areas where there is real room for cooperation. It's a welcome fact that, of course, there has been discussion on the margins of the summit on the issue of North Korea. This is a critical issue. But also, of course, in terms of personalities and politics, President Moon is coming eventually to the end of his one term as president. And I think there may be a calculation on the part of some in Tokyo that they want to wait until there is a new leader in Seoul before making more investments in terms of this personal sort of dynamic. It's also unfortunate, of course, that the United States can't act as a broker. And I think this reflects the diminution in American global influence, however much it's welcome that the Biden administration wants to work to bring these two allies closer together.
Yeah, I just want to make clear that the foreign ministers of the United States and South Korea were the only ones who met in Cornwall this time, with the absence of the Japanese FM this time. Do you want to add your perspective, Dr. Norber?
Yes, I think John makes really the critical points. And the fact of the matter is there is a heavy domestic limitation, certainly for Suga and to some extent Moon in his final year. And all eyes really are on his relationship with Biden. But this foreign minister meeting was important, not only in terms of a commitment on denuclearization, discussion about North Korea, as John mentioned, but also about Myanmar and other regional approaches. The idea of establishing more multilateral approaches, again, something that these two democracies have in common and that the democracies at the table at the G7 wish to underscore. And so that requires global cooperation, and these democracies line up for that. And when we look at crisis, whether it's concern about China and the rise of autocracy, or whether it is about events in places like Myanmar, there is common cause, and that's terribly important, and something that Japan also agrees with, even if it's less explicit in terms of the meeting between Moon and Suga.
Right, and what are your thoughts and forecasts for the ties, Dr. Reiterer?
Well, I think there is a sort of building blocks. A few weeks ago, there was a trilateral meeting of the national security advisors of Japan, Korea, and the United States. I think there is an understanding that the two countries have to work together in terms of security, in terms of values, and in terms of China. I think what is needed, and perhaps that's a lesson to be studied in Europe, there is a need for leadership. We would not have overcome the problems after the Second World War in Europe if there had not been leadership. Leaders took it in their hands to overcome the problems of the past. And that's unfortunately missing in between the two countries. And I think that could be a chance for a new beginning when two leaders, perhaps two new leaders, take up that issue and say, well, that's what we want to achieve in the interest of the two countries, but also in the interest of all those sitting around the table at the G7 and later on in other forums. So I think there is a perspective, and I'm an optimist that the generation will come which will jump over that hurdle of the past.
Well, with a series of multilaterals and bilateral engagements this coming week, with most of the leaders at Carbis Bay reconvening in Brussels for a NATO meeting Monday, Mr. Biden's first summit with his Russian counterpart in Geneva, and South Korean President Moon Jae-in's state visits to Austria and Spain, we'll definitely find out more on where and how the world in the post-pandemic era is headed. Dr. Michael Reiterer from Vienna, Dr. Stephen Norbers joining us from Hawaii, and Dr. John Nilsson-Wright from Cambridge for us this evening. Many thanks to all of you gentlemen for your insights and expertise. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Kanya.